famously built a prison in San Diego that was notorious for letting criminals escape. His family produced 10,000 bottles of champagne that had no bubbles, and he was ultimately eaten by an alligator. Oh, and he's also the father of California wine. This is the American Wine Rebel Show, where we dive into the history of American wine and uncover American wine's best kept secrets. I'm Meg Siobhan, and I hope you poured yourself a glass of something good because I don't like drinking alone. This story is literally wilder than fiction, and today we're going to dive into the history of Agoston Haraszthy and his tie to American wine. And we're going to unpack some wine along the way. So pour yourself a glass. Today, I am drinking a glass of this Heritage Red Blend from the Stampede Vineyard from Little Trouble Wine Company. This is one from Lodi, California. It's delicious, and we're going to talk about it in a little bit. But first, let's dive into some of the history behind why I chose this bottle. So today we're talking about a guy named Agoston Haraszthy, who you may or may not have heard of. But if you have, you've probably heard something that's not true about him. So there's a lot of lore and stories that are associated with this guy's name. He's known as the father of California wine, but he also is accredited as being a count from Hungary, which he's not. He is from Hungary, but he was not a count. And then some other fanciful things about him. There's a lot of stories floating around, but we're going to unpack the truth today because honestly, the truth already feels like something out of a Wild West novel. So there's no reason to invent more stories about him. So he was born in Hungary and raised there. And one of the many myths about him is that he immigrated to the United States as a refugee, but that's not true. He immigrated not to escape persecution so much as just to escape a more strict lifestyle that he would have been required to adhere by in Hungary. He wanted to pursue the American dream and to make something for himself rather than being constrained by the rules about the class he was born into or what he was supposed to do, which honestly, totally get. So he emigrated to the United States in 1849 and originally moved to Wisconsin with his family. Stayed there for a little bit, tried to make some wine, didn't really pan out, and then bam, gold rush hits, and he takes his family and heads out to California, to San Diego, not to mine gold, but he just felt like there was a lot of opportunity there. So San Diego at the time was not the beachy, very busy city it is today. There was probably about 600 people there when he moved there, and he was elected sheriff of the town. And San Diego at the time was looking to build a new prison. So they were trying to find someone who could build this prison, and Augustine said, "I'll do it," and threw his bid into the mix, which kind of sounds like a conflict of interest by today's standards, but they did choose Augustine to be the one to build this prison. And it was a disaster. The first prison that he tried to build was literally washed away in the rain. And so then he goes back to the council and he says he needs more money to try to build it again. So at this point, the project is already way over budget. He builds this prison, it gets passed through, and then it becomes so well known for being a prison that is easy to escape from. There are at least two accounts of criminals jumping out the window and escaping, and then one story of the most famous criminal to escape from this prison. His name was Roy Bean. And lore has it that he literally dug himself out from underneath the prison using tools that were smuggled into him by some of his lady friends and lovers inside of bouquets of flowers. Gonna like so the San Diego story has nothing to do with wine, but I tell it to set the stage for who Augustine is as a person. He is someone who is opportunistic. He is maybe a little bit more of an ideas guy than an executioner, but he's also persistent. And when he puts his mind to something, he does it. So San Diego is not really his place. So he decides to move his family north to San Francisco near the Sonoma area. So they head on up there. And when they get to San Francisco, Augustine buys some land. And this land was a winery that he names Buena Vista, which means beautiful view. And it's at this winery that he starts to do a lot of the things that he is most well known for in the wine community and leaving a wine legacy. So he did a number of really good things at this winery. One being At the time that he bought this winery, a lot of the other vineyard planters and workers were planting their grapevines at the base of the valley or just on the flat land. And Augustine decided to plant his vines on the slopes of the mountains instead. And this is actually really genius. And this is something that happens a lot today. It might seem a little bit counterintuitive. Specifically in the area that Augustine was in, it got a decent amount of rainfall, which sounds like it would be a good thing for growing plants. But the thing is, you want some rain, you want to keep the plants alive, but you don't want too much. So we can think about it as comparing a grape to making, let's say, lemonade from a powdered drink mix. So you've got the powdered drink mix, and that's all the good stuff that are inside of the grape, the acid, the sugar, the flavors. You want to have that in there. And so you've got the powdered drink mix, and you want to add just enough water that you've got this really nicely concentrated juice. But imagine if it rains and it rains and it rains and it gets a lot more water. The grapes have a lot more water to absorb through their roots and put into the grapes. And it doesn't just make a bigger, better grape, it actually dilutes the juice that's inside of the grape, causing the wine that's produced to be a little bit lower quality. Even today, a lot of the world's best vineyards are planted on slopes because it allows that rain to naturally run off rather than the grapes just sitting in this dirt and water mud soup and just absorbing too much water. So that's the first thing that our guy Augustine did when he got to Sonoma. The second thing he did was building some of California's first wine caves. So at the winery, he actually tunneled into the ground a couple times to build these caves where he could store and age wine. It was temperature controlled, it was sheltered against the elements, and this is really good for wine that you want to sit there and age. And even today, there's a lot of places in California and in the world that have wine caves that are attached to the wineries that you can actually visit. And it's a really cool experience. So if you get the chance to visit a wine cave, I would definitely recommend that. But these are things that Augustine did to start to build this legacy and start to pioneer himself as one of the leaders of California wine. He published a couple books and articles on winemaking best practices that helped assist some of the other winemakers in the area. And then Agoston gets another great idea. So at the time in California, a lot of the wine that was being produced was either American hybrid grapes or wine from this grape called the mission grape. And this grape was brought over by the Spanish missionaries. It was first planted in New Mexico and then made its way up the West Coast. It was called the mission grape because the Spanish missionaries who planted it at missions. And most of the wine it made was pretty basic sacramental wine. It wasn't super complex or super great wine. And Augustine had this idea to go to Europe and bring back some of the really complex grapevines from Europe and plant them in California and make really quality wine from them. So he goes to Europe and he travels all over. He goes to France, he goes to Spain, he goes to Italy, and he tries a bunch of different wines. Some he likes, some he doesn't. The ones that he does like, he brought clippings back to California of them and planted them and started making wine with them. And he continually challenged himself to make better and better wine. There is a little bit of controversy here as far as what Augustine's actual role in all of this was, with some grapes in particular. So, one of the hard things about this is the bookkeeping they did at the time, they called the grapes different things than what we call them now. So, we have to surmise a little bit based off of the notes we have, what we think the grapes were that he brought. And one of the ones in general, there's a lot of debate over is Zinfandel. So, Zinfandel is one of the most widely planted grapes in America. It had a big boom in the 1970s, but it's kind of known as America's grape, even though it's originally from Italy, where it's called Primitivo. So, Agoston Haraszthy is sometimes credited with bringing Zinfandel over. Others say it was already in America and he just led the charge on making it popular. Either way, Zinfandel and a lot of these other French, Italian, and Spanish grapes, he started to lead the charge on making quality wine with them. This was great, except originally, Agoston thought that he would be reimbursed for all of the plantings that he brought to California. But after he brought them all back, found out that he was not going to get reimbursed for any of them. And this was devastating. financially for him. But if we know anything from this story so far, we know that Augustin doesn't give up. So he decided that it was fine. He was going to find a way to make money. So one of the things he started to do was sell off little plots of Buena Vista Winery to other winemakers, one of whom which was a guy by the name of Charles Krug. But that's a story for another day. He also took his winery and he incorporated it as a Buena Vista Viticultural Society. So he sold off shares of his winery to make some money. And that seemed to work for a little bit, but it meant he lost complete control over the decisions that were made at the winery. And then the third thing that happened, his son was in Champagne, France, learning how to make sparkling wine. He comes back to America and then joined Augustin at his winery, and they decided to make some champagne together. All in all, they made over 10,000 bottles of champagne. It was going to be great. They were going to open it, they were going to celebrate, it was going to make them some money. They open up the champagne, and there were no bubbles. I don't know about you, but I've had bottles of champagne before that I have put the little stopper on and then put them in my fridge and went back to them a few days later, and maybe the stopper didn't seal completely, or it was sitting too long, opened it and it's gone flat. And that's like one of the most disappointing moments. I'm a bubbly girl, so that would be so tragic for me to have bubbly without the bubbles. So, all in all, Augustin's son gets fired as the champagne winemaker, and Augustin is once again devastated financially. But he has another idea. He starts to take the vines that were in his vineyards that he still had, and he noticed that they were planted pretty far apart from each other. So he decided to take them and, using the vines he had, propagate additional vines to fill in the gaps to create a more dense vineyard. So he does that. It got a lot of backlash at the time from other winemakers in the area. And we don't know for sure whether that actually panned out for him. He still was financially pretty ruined. And around the same time, he took a pretty politically unpopular stance on some labor laws. And so he decided that California just wasn't his place. Things weren't going well for him, and he needed something new. Because if we know anything about our guy Augustin, he does not give up. So he decided that he was going to find a new venture to go after. And where was his new venture? In Nicaragua. So our guy goes from California all the way down to Nicaragua, where he decides he's going to make and export rum. So he goes down there, that's going okay for him. But then this is when tragedy really starts to strike him. His wife goes down to join him, and she contracts yellow fever through a mosquito that bites her, and she ends up passing away. His father goes down, he gets sick also, and on the boat back to home, also passes away. So Augustine is down there and he's trying to make the rum thing work. He's got a meeting with some guys about some logistics for the rum business, and he's hanging out on the edge of the river waiting for them to meet him. They're a little bit late, so he's hanging out there. And that's where Augustine's story ends. He was never seen again. He literally disappeared. So, what happened to him? Well, when the guys who were supposed to meet him got there, they saw that his coat was there, his mule and horses were there, all of his stuff was there, and he was just gone. In the area, though, they'd recently been having some issues with alligators. So, the best assumption about what happened to him was he was either dragged into the river or he fell into the river and was eaten by alligators. And that may sound like it's the end of the story, but Augustine's legend continued to live on in California. Despite the fact that California didn't really work out for him personally, he left a lasting mark. A lot of his best practices as far as planting grapes and making wine stuck around and continued to guide winemakers. And all of the cuttings that he brought over and made popular stuck around and started to make California what it is today. California today is known for Zinfandel, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay. All of these are European grapes, like the ones that Augustine brought over. Buena Vista Winery itself stuck around and was bought out a couple times by various companies. It's still around today, but it's changed hands a few times. And so, to celebrate Augustine's legacy, I decided not to go with a bottle from Buena Vista, and instead I've got this bottle here from Little Trouble. So, why did I choose this bottle? So, this here is from the Stampede Vineyard. It is from Lodi. And I do want to say I love the label. But there's a couple reasons I chose this bottle. So this is a red blend that contains Zinfandel, the mission grape, both of which were influential in Augustin's life. And then it also contains Syrah, Grenache, and Alicante, which are French grapes like the ones that Augustine would have brought over to California. The Zinfandel that's in this bottle contains some old vines, which is not uncommon for Zinfandel vines in California, but I love the tie back to history here. But then one of the other things that really caught my attention about this bottle is from the winery's own website. They say about the Stampede Vineyard that California rodeo dust is our favorite flavor descriptor of this site, with heaps of wild brush herbs and a watermelon candy to boot. I love that. Rodeo dust. Agoston went out to California as part of the gold rush that is like prime Wild West era. And so this wine really, in my opinion, encompasses everything that he stood for and was trying to accomplish. I also love specifically that Little Trouble is low intervention when they're making their wines. They're really involved in choosing high quality grapes and want to make sure the process is as natural and true to fruit as possible, which I do appreciate. So let's give this a taste. That is bright. There's a lot of tart cherry, raspberry. I'm definitely getting that watermelon sort of jammy candiness to it. Really light body and a just nice light integrated tannin. I bet this would be amazing chilled. To me feels like the perfect campfire wine. I want to be sitting around this fall at a bonfire, drinking this in the evening with some friends. And I just love the bottle too, and I think it just really fits with the vibe of the whole wine. This little barn sort of outside campy vibe it's got to it. And I do love that it says what you doing tonight right on the bottle, because tonight I want a bonfire with a glass of this. Do let me know in the comments, have you ever had a wine that's been made with the mission grape before, or do you have any thoughts on this crazy story? And if you're still here, thank you for sticking around for the first episode of the American Wine Rebel Show. Each week on Wednesdays, we're going to be dropping a new episode of the American Wine Rebel Show where we deep dive into an American wine history story, open up a bottle of something that's a little bit different than you would get at your grocery store, and unpack all of it. So if you like this story, if you want to hear more about the wild side of American wine, subscribe, follow me on YouTube or Instagram at American Wine Rebel. Check out AmericanWineRebel.com and tell your friends, because wine is more fun when you're not drinking alone. Cheers!